Hello there from the sunny Isle of Wight, and thank you for joining us on the last day of the third week of the Disruptive Innovation Festival. Late this morning or afternoon or evening, wherever you are in the world today, we're being joined by Benita and Daniel to talk on a session on the sharing economy, and more specifically on or can the sharers share. So hopefully this is going to be a very provocative and interesting discussion. And I know that Benita and Daniel are both very keen for your participation and interaction with the session. There are really two main ways in which you can do that. The first is using the Q&A function on the Google Hangout, which you'll find depending on the screen you're on. If you're on the event page, it will be a little tab in the bottom left-hand corner of the video screen. And if you've already clicked on that, you'll find it on the right-hand stream of your screen. The second way to interact is via Twitter, and I know that both our participants today are very active on Twitter, so there's a number of different hashtags you can use to feed into the discussion. The first is ThinkDiff, which is the Disruptive Innovations hashtag, and that's ThinkDiff with just one F. But we've also got Sharing Economy, hashtag Sharing Economy, and Can We Share, hashtag Can We Share. So we'll be monitoring all those streams and trying to feed them through to Benita as questions and comments. But without any much further ado, I'm going to pass over to Daniel, who's going to sort of introduce the session more broadly and start the discussion. So thank you both for being with us today, and over to you.
Hi, Seb. Thank you, and hi, everyone. I'm here from Rome, actually, which is anything but sunny today, but we'll survive. My role is to be the moderator, so I'll be checking questions, and please do send them through. We want lots of questions. But most importantly, let's talk about Benita. Benita is going to tell us about the sharing economy. Can the sharers share? As you might know, Benita is the chief sharer of Compare and Share and the People Who Share. I don't want to steal the spotlight for too long, so Benita, tell us a bit about why you're here talking about this and what's going on in the sharing economy at large.
Well, it's probably useful just to start off with something of a definition of the sharing economy, because the sharing economy has been in the press a lot recently, and there are various ideas about what the sharing economy is. But just for the purposes of having a really clear definition, the sharing economy is a socio-economic ecosystem that's actually built around the sharing of human and physical resources. It's multifaceted, it's very broad.
Hi, Benita. Very sorry, you were muted just there.
Little technical problems, guys. We'll be right with you.
You can unmute yourself just by scrolling to the top of the screen and clicking on the microphone there.
Okay, no idea how that happened, but I don't know at what point I cut out.
Well, we will be talking about the perils of technology, so I guess that kind of introduces that topic.
But fundamentally what we're going to be looking at today and what we want to talk about is this whole idea of can the sharers share. So in other words, can the leadership of the sharing economy share? How are businesses collaborating with each other? How are they creating or not creating a more sharing culture, and what might the benefits be of that? And also, does the sharing economy in and of itself actually create a more equal society? So some of these bigger, more controversial questions are what we're going to be looking at today, and hopefully there's going to be lots of comments and interaction from those of you who are taking part today in this Hangout.
So before I move on to the first, let's say, macro topic, and we do have a number of comments that have come in over the past number of days through Twitter, let me just remind all of you, hashtags can we share, hashtag sharing economy, and hashtag thinkdiff with one F to send us your questions. So Benita, point number one is the sharing economy actually enabling a more sharing, equal society? Or is it just benefiting those who have already access to resources and opportunities? In layman's terms, there have been a few articles out and about recently about how the sharing economy is only really useful to the middle class. What's your take on that?
Fundamentally, the sharing economy is at something of a crossroads. We've got to bear in mind this is a very nascent early stage economy, but we are at a point where the sharing economy has huge potential. It has huge potential to to deal with the fundamental inequalities that we have in the world. So I'm going to give you a really good example of where the sharing economy is handling and tackling poverty and inequality head on. In the UK, Fair Share, what do? They deliver food that would otherwise go to landfill to people living in food poverty. Essentially, they're dealing with the fact that there are tons and tons of food that needlessly get wasted, and they're diverting that perfectly good food to those people who need it. Last year, they delivered food for 12 million meals to people living in food poverty. So there's an example of where the sharing economy is head-on, working towards creating a more equal, accessible society. And there are plenty of other great examples of where this is happening. However, what we're also seeing is that a number of the participants in the sharing economy in what I would like to call the formal sharing economy. So, for example, the technology digital enabled platforms, the Airbnbs of this world, Zipcar, TaskRabbit, and so on. And what we're seeing when we start to look at the demographics of who are using those sites, there have been some studies recently looking at the idea, which is a very middle class phenomenon, that actually a number of those that are using these sites are earning in excess of $100,000 a year. So we're looking at, a professional, educated middle class who are using those services that are part of what I would call the sort of more formal part of the sharing economy, and certainly the aspect of the sharing economy that is getting a lot of attention. But what we need to remember that the sharing economy is an incredibly broad church. It is multifaceted. And organizations like Food Cycle, and I mentioned Fair Share already, but a number of these organizations that are tackling the issues around poverty and inequality in society are just as much a part of the sharing economy as companies like, for example, Airbnb.
So we had a tweet come in yesterday, I believe, from Duncan McLaren, and he says, the sharing economy can increase social equity, but only if justice is designed in from the start. What do you think he means with that, and do we have any examples?
Well, what's interesting about that is that when you consider what the sharing economy really means, what we're talking about is something that is very purpose-led. It's heartfelt. When you share, you are giving something of yourself, but it is very much about that reciprocity. It's a two-way street. And sharing is something that to share is to be human. We would not be here. We would not be human beings. We would not be a society. We would not have survived as a people, as a nation, as the societies, as the global citizens. We would not be here were it not for sharing. And that's something that's really incredibly important to remember. And so ultimately, the companies that really have a true sharing purpose at heart are those companies and organizations that their sharing mission is built in to potentially into their legal structure, but certainly they have a very clear mission. So I will give you some examples from my own company, Compare and Share. When I set out to build Compare and Share, what we looked at was we wanted to embed our purpose within the company structure. We wanted to set up a company that would deliver on both purpose and profit in equal measure. And so in fact what we did was we have created effectively our own legal structure, working with a fantastic lawyer called Patrick Andrews. We've developed something that we call an S Corp. And essentially any of the shareholders and the directors of Compare and Share have an equal duty to deliver on purpose and profit in equal measure. And there are a number of other companies within the sharing economy.
From the floor, if you don't mind, Anita. Stuart is asking us, how do we separate out or deal with the good and bad aspects of the sharing economy? Can we promote some aspects and not others? This is a question from Stuart.
Great question, Stuart. And what I would say about that is that I would say that what we need to be doing is we need to be focusing our efforts and our energies on the good aspects of the sharing economy, on the potential for it. It's very much about enabling this reality by promoting and spotlighting and showcasing those positive initiatives that are creating positive change in the world. Because essentially, to look at it, you focus on the problems, you focus on issues, all you do is perpetuate and create more issues. but actually by focusing and spotlighting the shiny examples of the sharing economy out there. It's something that's, you know, that works incredibly well. I wrote a piece for The Guardian back in June, which was really looking at this whole notion of all the sort of mudslinging that's been going on in terms of the sharing economy. And you know, some of the things that I talked about in that blog post were the fact that actually the sharing economy it's an incredibly early stage, and to a certain degree, by all the mudslinging that has been going on, effectively what you're doing is before the baby can even walk, you know, you're throwing them into the road. And I think what we need to be doing is really looking at the sharing economy and the breadth of it, and not get caught up in this very narrow perspective on the sharing economy. The sharing economy is not simply Airbnb and Uber. The sharing economy is incredibly broad and multifaceted.
So I just posted the article in our group chat here for anyone that's interested in reading that more in depth. Benita, we mentioned that we need to focus on the good, and I'd like to really get into what that good is in your perspective. But you did mention Uber and Airbnb that have been in the media, probably at the forefront of criticism in a number of countries for a lot of different reasons. We are talking about, are we creating a really more sharing, equitable society? So I am going to bring up the Airbnb criticism about how it's actually jacking up rental prices, making it not so fair in a number of cities. We have strips of Airbnb, let's say streets in Amsterdam and what have you not, which doesn't seem to be quite fair. So what's the good in that? What is the good in the sharing economy that Airbnb is creating that we should be looking at?
Well, there are a number of examples. So, for example, how Airbnb contributes to local economies. When people come and they visit a country and they stay in, it doesn't have to be an Airbnb property, it could be a Whimsy property or a home away property, it could be a property that they've booked via Compare and Share. The point is that when people are engaging in this peer-to-peer rental of spaces, what they're actually doing is they're staying in the local economy. Their money is staying in the local economy, and there's lots of evidence to back that up. And you know, Airbnb themselves have done a number of studies that look at the contribution that is made to the local economy when people are staying in not the typical tourist areas. They're out in more suburban areas. They're eating in local cafes. They're meeting local people. I myself am back from an experience from this summer in Morocco with my family, and the kind of experience that we had was very much a locals experience. You know, we were invited to a village wedding. We were involved in the local community, and you know, for a family holiday, that's not always necessarily something that you expect to be. But actually, that is where the sharing economy aspect of this really comes in, because you are really starting to make a contribution to that local economy, rather than, for example, you know, contributing to the large corporations in those particular countries. So I think that's one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is really about this social aspect of it. And when you share, for example, you use a service like LiftShare, for example, here in the UK, or BlaBlaCar, you're sharing a ride with other people, and the benefits are that not only are you meeting other people, so there's a social aspect to it, there's a community aspect, you make new friends, but also there are planetary benefits to that. You're lowering carbon. What we're talking about is this shift from ownership to access, and the whole notion that rather than having to own goods, what we're actually doing is we're starting to access shared goods. And the way that I look at it is there are two things in this world that we can't change. One, that we live on a planet of finite resources. And the other aspect is that we live on a planet with a growing population. What we can change and what we can do is start to share those resources. And what we do know, there are over £3.5 trillion worth of unused, of idle resource. And what we also know, that 40,000 people die each day because they don't have access to food, shelter, and water. And actually, when you start to look at how potentially technology and the sharing economy could connect to those haves with those needs, that's where you have huge potential for social good. But much of this is about what's already happening in this nascent economy and the potential for it.
Thank you, Benita, for that. We had another comment from April Rin, sorry if I butcher her name, who actually had a session on the sharing economy a couple of days ago. So if you missed that, make sure you look in the archive on thinkdiff.co. She gave a great introduction about the sharing economy in general. She says, sharing economy leadership can share on many levels: vision, nurturing community, or simplest yet hardest, data and lessons. What do you think about that, Benita? Are we doing enough of that?
Well, I would say, and this is a subject that's very dear to my heart, so when I started this work, it's now coming up to 5 years ago, hard to believe how much has changed and developed. I mean, the term sharing economy wasn't even used. And, you know, when I sort of look at what's happened in those 5 years, and one of the things that we've tried very hard to do with the people who share is really say, actually, it's really incredibly important that those thought leaders and the leadership of the sharing economy and those that are real champions and advocates and ambassadors in this space are walking the talk, are sharing themselves, are sharing, collaborating and finding ways to work together. And when we started something called National Sharing Day here in the UK, which then of course, you know, was adopted around the world and became Global Sharing Day, one of the first things we did was to approach as many of the sort of activists and the champions and the ambassadors in the sharing economy as we possibly could. Because our perspective is that we need to be working together. And it's, you know, it's absolutely true to say that, you know, that meets with mixed response. That meets with mixed response. Some people are very open and really embrace that and come on board and want to get involved in that. And for others, it's not about promoting the sharing economy, but it's about promoting their particular brand within the sharing economy. And this is something that we really need to be tackling and we need to look at very closely. Because actually, if this is to mainstream and to grow, then those proponents and those advocates need to be walking the talk and need to be true to the values and the visions that they espouse.
Thank you, Benita. Before I sort of led you into our second big question, which is, are companies within the sharing economy actually employing sharing practices themselves? But before we get into that, we do have another question from the floor. Beck would like to know, how closely linked to charity is the sharing economy, and what are the key differences? A question from Beck.
Excellent question. So I would say that what we're really talking about here is the difference between giving and sharing. And I talk about sharing as sustainable giving, because when you share, it's two-way, it's reciprocity, and there is mutual benefit happening in each direction. That said, there's an overlap between sharing and giving, because of course, when people give, and we know from all of the research that's carried out about why people give to charities, for example, they're not just giving, there's always something that comes back. People might give because it makes them feel good about themselves. They might give because it elevates their status within society. They might give for all kinds of reasons, but there's always something that is coming back. And so I have always seen, and the People Who Share, which is a not-for-profit organisation, we have always worked very closely with the voluntary sector, with the not-for-profit or the charity sector. And so there's lots of crossover. But what I would say, and where the differences really lie, is in this question about sustainability and the whole notion of aid and where does that take us. And you know, the old adage of, you know, if you give a man a fish, or if you teach a man to fish, what that can do. And the sharing economy really is about that. It's about micro entrepreneurship. It's about micro-social entrepreneurship, I would say most importantly. It's about people being able, it's about people power. People are able to trade and are able to swap and exchange and borrow from other people. It's about a system that's built around people and planet. So there's something that's fundamental in the notion of the social benefit of the sharing economy, and that's where I would say you have that crossover with the charity world. I don't know, Beck, does that answer your question? Maybe there's a follow-on question from that you might have.
Be sure to let you know, Benita, if Beck has a follow-up question, and I'll just take this as an opportunity to remind everyone, please do send through your questions. If you're following us on Twitter, hashtags sharing economy and can we share, and hashtag thinkdiff, 1F, of course. Send in your questions. Benita, you did mention the big word micro-entrepreneurship, which is a bit at the heart of a number of discussions on the sharing economy right now, you do know what article I'm referring to, the one about platform capitalism, which is a bit of a sticky one, isn't it? But I would like to, we've discussed things like this often before. I would like to talk about Uber. Uber and micro-entrepreneurship. There's a lot of criticism towards Uber, but I think that this word helps explain why some of it might be a bit excessive. What are your thoughts on Uber? Is it a sharing economy business or not?
Just bear with me one second. Obviously, a very important question. We're just trying to address it a little bit. I believe there's a little bit of a sound quality issue.
Yeah,
so just
I'm getting you a
10
bit.
seconds while we just try and fix that, because it would be much more helpful. Daniel, perhaps you want to just remind people of the hashtags and so on while I'm just doing that.
Yeah, while we fix audio issues, I'm going to take the opportunity to remind you about the hashtags again. Hashtag sharing economy, that is hashtag sharing economy. Hashtag can we share, that is hashtag can we share. And of course, think diff. So hashtag think diff with one F. Do send through your questions about the sharing economy. We are here with Benita Matowska, Chief Sharer of Compare and Share, discussing disrupting the disruptors. Can sharers share, and are they really sharing? So it's a pretty big topic right now. There's a bunch of articles out that have been coming out over the past few weeks on sharing economy. Is it really sharing? Is it not? And we're going to respond to some of those articles. But we do welcome some questions from the floor as well. Actually, we really want some questions from the floor. Let me know, Benita, how the audio system is going on the other side. Have you fixed it? Benita? Hello? So it seems like I'm here by myself right now. Oh, Benita just left. I think she'll be back with us quite soon.
Yeah, I think we just lost Benita there for a moment while she's adjusting her technical issues. I mean, you're quite a, you're a reasonably a bit of a thought leader in this space as well, Daniel. I wonder if you had any perspective on some of the issues that we've been discussing.
Well, probably most of my answers would be in line with Benita's, I think, but I do very strongly believe in the fact that it is a very I'm just going to finish my answer. We are in a very nascent space, and we do.
I've missed all of that, Daniel. Sorry.
Oh, I'm just answering a filler question, Benita. Seb asked me what I thought about some of the topics that we were talking about while we waited for you to reconnect, and I said I'm very much usually in agreement with you on most things, and I do believe that we are in a very nascent field. Sharing economy is relatively new, so we do have a lot to learn, and we do need to learn how to look at things differently from how we're used to if we want to take things forward. But enough of me. We had a question for Benita regarding Uber. Is it a sharing economy business or not, and why so if it is?
Really interesting question, and this seems to be, for some reason, getting, I have to say, an absolutely undue and inordinate amount of disproportionate attention. So that's my view, is that way too much attention is being asked, and in terms of the whole kind of Uber question. So here's my take on it. So ultimately, when we talk about a sharing economy, we talk about this idea of a system, an economic system that's built around the sharing of resource. And if you look at Uber in one context, what Uber does do, and the actual experience, and I had a recent experience of using the Uber service several times while I was over in San Francisco, because the public transportation system in San Francisco is not particularly good and the distances are very, very large. So personally, I would prefer to walk wherever I can, which I can do in my hometown of Brighton, but clearly that was not an option when trying to get from Palo Alto to San Francisco. And so I had several experiences of using Uber while I was in San Francisco. What I would say about that experience, first of all, from a user perspective, an excellent experience, affordable, reliable. But what's interesting about it from a sharing perspective is that when you use those kinds of services, what that does is it tells you something. It tells you that there is actually no need to own a vehicle. Absolutely no need to own a vehicle. And for me, that's the difference, because services like Uber, where they contribute to the sharing economy, And they're clearly not a purpose-driven sharing economy business. So just to be really clear about that, they're not a purpose-driven sharing economy business. But where they do contribute to the sharing and to the sharing economy is that by nature of the way that their service operates, it makes it easy for people not to own. It makes it easy for people to access a vehicle when they need it rather than owning a vehicle when they need it. And a service that effectively takes cars off the road, in my mind, is making a positive contribution to society. The other thing that's really interesting is that every opportunity that I had when I did take an Uber when I was out in San Francisco, I interviewed all of the Uber drivers that I spoke to. And their experience was also very, very positive. And I mean, these are random people, and they didn't know, who I am. I'm just some random person that's using their service. And those were just the questions that were asked in my, going back to my days of being a journalist, just to inquire and ask about what that experience is like. And they all talked about the idea of being their own boss, of having flexible work, of earning enough of the money that they need to earn, they talked to me about the things that they've been doing previously and how this was so much better. So it's an interesting one because there's been a lot of questions about, labour in sharing economy and how, rates of pay and fair wages and so on. But actually that hasn't been the experience of many of the people who are actually working in the sharing economy. So I think that's quite, it's quite revealing, really.
Benita, I have a question from Twitter about something you were talking about earlier, but we sort of got sidetracked. The question comes to us from, and I have now relost it, from Mass Mosaic, and they say they'd love to hear a bit more about the legal structure for the sharing economy that you're pioneering. Could you please explain a bit about that?
So the legal structure, I mean, essentially what we've done is, as you can appreciate, and this is coming from setting up a company in the UK. But essentially what we did is we took inspiration from the US. And in the US, there's something called a B Corp. And a B Corp, for those of you who don't know what a B Corp is, essentially what it does is it puts purpose and profit at the heart of the company. And it means that those directors of the company have a fiduciary duty to deliver on both purpose and profit in equal measure. And that's essentially what a B Corp is. So effectively what we've done with what we call the S Corp or the Share Corp in the UK, effectively what we've done is it's very much the same thing, but we wanted to go a few steps further. And we wanted to say, okay, well, yes, the mission is embedded, but also we wanted to look at some other aspects of this. We wanted to say, okay, well, how can we go further to embed the practices within the legal structure? Could we, for example, have could we look at things like there's an idea called presumed abundance, which again comes from the US. And what it means is that from an investment perspective, as an investor, when you invest in a company, what you do essentially, it's like pay it forward. You say that a percentage of the return on your investment will be reinvested in some way. And this is a growing practice. And so we said, well, what if we were to say, well, anyone who invests in a share in an S Corp, that actually they were making a commitment to reinvest a percentage of their return into the sharing economy as a whole. And these are some of the things that we've been looking at. What we've actually done on a practical level, as you can imagine, to create a whole new legal structure would take many, many years and many, many lawyers and would probably cost an awful amount of money. So what we did is we said, okay, how can we take the existing legal structures that exist in the UK and create a social business, so a for-profit company, but that has a social mission and that those shareholders have a responsibility? And actually, the answer is it's pretty straightforward. It just means that in our articles of association, we're a company limited by shares. In our articles of association, front and center is our purpose. It's the first thing you come to. And it's very clear that the responsibility of the shareholders is to deliver both on purpose and on profit. So it embeds what we do within our legal structure.
Thank you for that, Benita. That was in response to Mass Mosaic's question on Twitter. We do have another question from the floor, Benita, and I do think it really sort of introduces our third topic quite well. So I'm just going to to the third topic before I ask you the question, just to give a bit of setting. So one of the things that we would like to talk about today, and it's probably the most controversial bit of our conversation, is how are the different organizations in the sharing economy sharing, cooperating, or collaborating with each other? Is this like every other sector with a race to be the brand that owns the sharing economy, or is it something different? So that's the big topic, but the question we got from the floor, from Rachel, is why do you think that Uber, Lyft, and Airbnb get so much attention? Do you think it's because they actually replicate old models of doing business as opposed to disrupting them? So I think that fits quite well, doesn't it?
Well, I would say after working for over 20 years in the media, the answer is very, very clear. And the reason that these companies get the attention that they do, it comes down to money, quite frankly. They've had the investments, they have the resources, they have the means by which to attract the media attention. The media is incredibly fickle, having worked in it for over 20 years, and I'm sure Daniel would agree that we know how the media works and operates. And this is not some sort of scathing attack on the media, it's just the simple reality of how stories are, certain stories get more precedent over other stories. However, what I would say is that the answer to the question for me is that, so that's why I think they get so much attention. But actually, this question about the second part of the question, which is, do I think it's because they replicate old models of doing business as opposed to disrupting them? Actually, they don't replicate old models of doing business, because when you consider what they actually do, is they are peer-to-peer. We're talking about this notion of with Airbnb of peer-to-peer transactions. So in other words, before we had this whole notion of the sharing economy and peer-to-peer, it wasn't you didn't have the possibility to be able to trade online directly with another person. Before eBay came into being, this wasn't something that existed, and we were reliant on large corporations for buying and selling. So the business to consumer, or people as I prefer to call people, relationship has forever changed, because now people can trade with other people, and people themselves can become suppliers and creators and producers of goods and services. And this is incredibly empowering. So those companies, whilst they've had huge amounts of venture capital behind them, and therefore have attracted and engaged a certain amount of attention, and they're certainly, I mean, some of the valuations in the space, with Uber at 17 billion and Airbnb at 10 billion, tells you about something about their size. It doesn't mean to say that what they're doing and the way that they're doing it isn't disruptive. It is fundamentally disruptive. The question, I believe, is really what will happen next. And essentially, I believe what's really sort of underneath that question from Rachel is really this idea is, do they just simply propagate and prop up the old system? Does this ultimately just continue to create a similarly unequal society? And is that essentially the way that this works, that you'll have a few companies who will essentially monopolize the sharing economy, so it won't be a sharing economy at all, and actually is that any different from the system that we currently have? And I believe that's the real question, and we are at a crossroads.
Thank you for that, Benita. So I keep getting questions that I want to ask you because I know you'll enjoy them. Here's one from Laura, and it's something you and I often talk about, usually over Prosecco, and it's the question about purpose-driven sharing economy businesses and non-purpose-driven ones. So if you do divide these businesses into two types, one with a purpose and one that doesn't, are we actually saying that there is a Series A and a Series B within the sharing economy? This is a question from Laura.
Great question, Laura. And I love the question. Do love the question, of course. Again, it comes back to me, this whole idea that the sharing economy is multifaceted. And within the sharing economy, there are aspects of the sharing economy where no money is exchanged. There are aspects of the sharing economy, of course, where it's transaction-based. There are aspects of the sharing economy that are about being purpose-driven, and there are those that are not about being purpose-driven, but they're in some way contributing to the sharing of resource. And I believe that this is not about creating some kind of class system within the sharing economy, but it is about accepting that there is a breadth and that what we need to do is we need to shift this focus away from a very, very, very narrow part of the sharing economy and actually look at the diversity of the space. And that's why I mentioned some of these initiatives that are tackling poverty head on, because they're incredibly important. There is an organization called Share the World's Resources that some of you may know of. And, you know, Share the World's Resources, fundamentally, they don't consider themselves to be proponents of the sharing economy, but they're proponents of sharing. And they look at sharing on an international, on a global level. And they look at it on an institutional level. And they look at these questions of poverty and equality in the context of the global economic system and the global economic drivers. And, you know, that's just one example of an organization that doesn't tend to necessarily get a lot of airtime, a lot of media attention, but they have been working in the space of sharing for many years. And we just need to understand that what we're seeing and what gets the airtime is a very narrow aspect of the sharing economy. So, but I don't believe that what we're trying to do is create some sort of, you know, class system of sharing economy and, oh, okay, these are real sharing economy and these aren't. Whilst at the same time, I do believe that we need to be clear that there are differences. And there are those businesses for whom this is absolutely purpose-driven, and there are those for whom it is not. And there are probably some that don't know.
Thank you, Benita. I think that answers the question. But if you do have any questions for Benita Matowska here at our live session, please do send them via Twitter, hashtags CanWeShare, or hashtag sharing economy, or hashtag ThinkDiff. And speaking of ThinkDiff, we have a question directly from Seb, actually, who's very interested in the culture aspect of this conversation. There's been a session here at Diff on how culture-driven change historically takes a long time and is very hard to do. Now, I would be the first to say that a change of culture is necessary for the success of the sharing economy. But what he's asking you and not me is how important is the culture versus economic aspect of the sharing economy?
Well, the cultural aspect of the sharing economy is really where I entered this space, you know, at the sort of very kind of early stages when the term wasn't even being used. And for me, it really sort of comes down to this idea and what we set out to achieve with the people who share, which is the campaign to build a sharing economy. The reasons that the people who share exist is to champion and enable people to discover the sharing economy. And the reason that we developed this whole campaign, which started as National Sharing Day and became Global Sharing Day, and next year is becoming Global Sharing Week, is precisely because of this cultural aspect. And what we did is we developed something that we call a theory of change. And we looked at what is it that brings about a cultural shift, a culture change. Like how do you create how do you cause that shift to happen? And one of the key findings is that it's through experiences. So it's when someone has a positive experience of sharing or the sharing economy, this is something that if you have a positive experience of something, it makes sense. You want to do it again. You want to tell your friends. You want to spread the word. And that's really how many of these cultural movements grow. They grow by word of mouth. They grow by having a community of interest that says, this is good, this is something that I want to shout about, this is something that I want to spread. And so the cultural aspects of the sharing economy are incredibly important. I believe that, and we are of course talking about an economy, so clearly the economic aspects are fundamental, but I think what's really important is that the sharing economy is a socio-economic system. And the social, i.e. the cultural aspect, again, is in equal measure. So we talked about this idea of the legal structures and the, marrying profit and purpose in equal measure. Well, similarly, the cultural and the economic aspects are really important. But in order to bring about that culture change, what we have found is you need to give people a positive experience. And it's only by having those positive experiences that people are going to do it again, and they're going to tell their friends, and that word is going to spread. And that's how we grow it, and that's how we mainstream it.
Thank you, Benita. That was a question from Seb. Benita, we have about 20 minutes, and I think we're all quite interested in really addressing the question are the sharers, are the sharing businesses, whether they're purpose-driven or not, are they sharing and cooperating and collaborating enough, or are they not? What's your take on this?
Well, there's two sides to this. There's two sides to this. So, and I'll deal with the first part, which is that corporations, our corporations, our businesses, is there a businesses sharing? We have some really incredible data which says that corporations who are embracing sharing and sharing practices within their companies already generate 10% more revenues, and that is predicted to double within the next 12 months. And then this whole idea of sharing and collaboration within your business actually increases your bottom line. And it also increases your contribution to the planet. So that fundamentally sharing is good for business is the big message. And it's happening in the context of lots of corporations. We've got lots of examples out there of corporations getting involved in the sharing economy, be they Marks and Spencer's, be they B&Q, be they Marriott Hotels and Liquid Space, and many, many other examples. The bigger question that I believe we really need to be tackling is this bigger question about whether the sharing economy leadership, how we are sharing and collaborating. And my view is that we are not sharing and collaborating anywhere near as much as we need to be. We need to walk the talk. And my experience has been that we have, for Global Sharing Day, we approach, everybody within the sharing economy, or anyone and everyone, because it's all about partnerships. And that campaign is not about promoting the brand of the people who share. It's about promoting the sharing economy as a whole, and about opening up the sharing economy and making it discoverable for everybody. And my experience of running that campaign and instigating that campaign has been really mixed in terms of when we've approached various organizations in the sharing economy who are campaigning seemingly for the same thing. It's very mixed, and some absolutely embrace, with open arms. So I'm going to cite Peers and Shareable as two absolute shining examples of, where we've worked in a really fantastic collaborative way. Peers, for example, last year shared their technology so that we were able for the first time to be able to register events for Global Sharing Day, and that was an incredible contribution. People could log on, they could see on a global map, they could find out what was happening in their local area, and it really helped to grow and excite and enable many, many more people to discover the sharing economy. And similarly, Shareable have been incredibly involved and supportive with publishing lots of content and so on. And so there are some great examples out there. But there are also those who have been really sort of reticent and who it's been more difficult. And this is not about pointing fingers, and it's not about negativity, but it is about saying, okay, we need to really question if what we are really believe in, and if from the heart what we want is to really build a sharing economy, and we ourselves need to walk the talk. We ourselves need to share and collaborate. And sharing and collaboration does mean giving something up. It does mean that. But I believe that the new mode of doing business, and that the business skills of the future, are the skills of collaboration and sharing. And those companies and organizations who are good at sharing and good at collaboration will be the ones that will be sustainable and are future-proofing their business. But it needs to be part of the culture, not just something that we espouse. We need to walk the talk.
So we have a couple of questions coming in, Benita, and I would really like to get back to close that third point there, but I think these questions, again, you'll enjoy. So we have a question from Gemma. Gemma asks you, is the ability to be an entrepreneur, make money, access cheap services, or something else the most important part of the sharing economy? So I guess the question is, what is the most important part of the sharing economy?
The most important aspect of the sharing economy is creating a socioeconomic system that's built around the sharing of human and physical resources. And what that means is that we have finite resources, and what we need to do is our economy is fundamentally flawed. Fundamentally flawed. It's not sustainable. We're living in a time when we've seen, global social, economic, and environmental crises. This is not something that's going away. And the sharing economy, and the most important aspect of the sharing economy, is that it has the potential to provide a solution for these very complex global problems. But only if we prioritize and we actually truly do build an economy that is built around people and planet and the sharing of those human and physical resources.
Thank you, Benita. And another one right off the bat. Daryl asks us, can you give us some examples on something that's something to your mind should be shared but is not yet? And can you give us some examples of something you would not want to share?
Okay, so some things that people often ask me this, actually, because I've been described as an extreme sharer, and my husband would back that up. He says there's way too much sharing that goes on in our household, and you can probably imagine this is not a subject that I don't leave my work at work, basically. So my family would certainly back this up. Things that I don't want to share, I don't share my underwear. What else don't I share? Most people, it turns out, do not like to share their toothbrush. So those are things that that probably are not hot on my list of things that that I would necessarily want to share. But I do. It must be said, I do share most things. I even share my dog. There you go. And then I guess the question of something on my mind that should be shared but isn't yet. Look, I believe that there is huge potential for disruption across many other sectors. And for example, things like utilities, energy, those kinds of areas, water. There are many areas in which I believe the sharing economy is starting to head, but actually would have real social impact. And so, I would say that really there's nowhere effectively that it couldn't go. But I do believe that there are a number of those sectors that are really sort of ripe for disruption. I would also say that I believe that we're going to see a lot more in the arena of the labour market. I think the whole sort of context of the future of work and how we work and where we work and this whole idea of how the face of work is changing, and we are where our work is. We are mobile. We are able to access our work from many different places, and that whole idea of quality of life and how we're able to have much more flexible working conditions. I mean, this whole idea of going to the office 9 to 5, job for life. I mean, that has been completely disrupted. And I believe we're going to be seeing a lot more exciting things happening in the world of work. But most importantly within that, it's about this recognition that work can be about the thing that you feel passionate about, that you love. Do the things that you love. Do the things that you care about. And not only will you be much more fulfilled, but also the benefit and the good that you will create will be evident. So I think that whole area of work is really sort of ripe for disruption.
Thank you, Benita. I hope that answers your questions, Daryl. No sharing of underwear or toothbrushes. So moving on to the next question from Joe.
Some people may like to do that, Daniel, but I'm just saying it's probably not for me.
However, I'm fine with your answer.
Exactly.
So we have a question from Joe, who's sorry he's missed some of the session. You are forgiven, Joe. No worries. He asked a very interesting question, which I would like to tie in to trust, which is the one thing we discussed, and I think would wrap up the last 10 minutes nicely. But trust. The question from Joe. What about the language of the sharing economy? I've heard eBay referred to as part of the movement, but isn't that just selling stuff? And the reason, Benita, I say we tie into trust is because obviously there's a huge issue and system based on trust on eBay, isn't there?
No, absolutely. Just to talk about the issue of language. Language is incredibly important, and the labels, whether we talk about, there's various different terminology that has been used. So we've heard sharing economy, we've heard collaborative economy, we've heard collaborative consumption, we've heard many other versions of this. And actually language is incredibly important. And the reason it's incredibly important, and the reason that we have always consistently used the term sharing, is because sharing is heartfelt. To share is to be human. And because the problems that we're tackling in this world are seismic, they are huge, complex problems, what's needed is a solution that tackles those problems in a systemic, fundamental way. And whilst I believe it would be very nice were we all collaborating with each other, collaboration will not change the world, but sharing can and sharing will. And that's why language is important, because it goes back to this question about being purpose-driven. and about access for all. Everybody can share. Everybody has unlimited potential and capacity to share. And that's why language is really important, because this is about access for all people, not just for those who understand what terminology means, or for those who, for example, I believe that often collaboration is used more in a business context, but it needs to be about fundamental change, about purpose-driven fundamental change. And that's why I believe language is incredibly important.
So we have 10 more minutes, Benita, and we do have more questions coming in. Daryl has a follow-up question for a quote that I actually tweeted. You said, our economic system is flawed. What do you think needs to change besides more sharing? And how can we make this happen? This is quite a broad question, which could probably take up about an hour, but see what you can do with it, Benita.
Yeah, it could. I mean, fundamentally, when I say that the economic system is flawed, we have an economic system that is not sustainable, and the reason it's not sustainable, and the reason why we constantly have, economic crises, and we see, the economic system crashing around us, is because it is not a system that is built around people and planet. It works at odds with the planet and the people in it, and rather than being in synergy, it works at odds with them. And therefore, this whole idea that on the one hand, you've got over £3.5 trillion worth of idle assets, and on the other hand, you've got 40,000 people dying each day because of lack of access to those very things that are stockpiling in other parts of the world, makes absolutely no economic sense whatsoever. And also, virtually all companies don't actually put the true cost onto their balance sheet. So, for example, in the fashion industry, what we know is that those who are working to produce cotton, for example, in cotton production, there are very, very high levels of suicides. And there are many, many reasons for that. But the reasons fundamentally are about, it's to do with pesticides, it's to do with working conditions, and all of these factors. Now, those costs to community of those suicides, that cost is never shown on the balance sheet. It's never shown. There are many, many, many other examples of how we don't what's called internalize externalities. And fundamentally, a sharing economy is a system that actually looks at the whole picture, not just a tiny piece of it. It's systemic. It looks at the whole in a frank and honest way. And rather than hiding away the negatives and hiding away the negative costs, which then come back at a point when the system crashes because those things rise to the surface and are so apparent, actually sharing economy from the start embeds all of those aspects and builds a system that works and that is in synergy with both people and planet. And that is really what it's about. So what we need is systemic change. We can't be tinkering around the edges. We need to fundamentally look at the system and build something that is absolutely in its DNA, is purpose-driven and is people-driven and planetary-driven. So it has to be fundamental. It's in the DNA.
Thank you, Benita, for that. We have a bit more than 5 minutes left. I do have another question from the floor, which I think is interesting as we haven't touched this subject. So here it goes. Manish asks us, what about Indian economy? And what he means is, what he wants to know is, what about sharing in emerging markets such as India or China or Brazil? What's happening over there?
I love this question. There was a piece of research recently that was carried out that looked at participation rates in the sharing economy. And actually participation rates in the sharing economy were at their highest in Asia, which is really interesting when you consider. And in terms of people's appetite for sharing, again, very, very high across Asia. And what's interesting is that we are seeing, we see it from the perspective of the numbers of partners and which partners are involved in the activities that take place on Global Sharing Day. We see that there's a lot of activity that happens, not just in India, but also in China. I was in Shanghai just over a year ago as part of a social leadership delegation, and we were looking at some of these questions about this context of sharing in the context of developing and emerging markets. And one of the things that's very, very interesting, of course, is that, you know, in developing countries, and in many of developing countries, and also in low-income communities, sharing is what you do. Sharing is a necessity. You know, I mentioned, you know, being in Morocco this summer, and, you know, car sharing is a necessity of life. Everybody does it. It's what you do. You know, you're much less likely to see empty seats in cars in developing countries because it's a necessity of life. Why on earth would you have that, you know, that waste? And so actually what we do see is that, you know, the cultural aspects of sharing are very, very much embedded, and we see that in terms of the fabric of communities. So in many ways, it isn't surprising that the levels of participation and some of the studies that have been carried out show. I was just actually pulling up the study just to see if I've actually got some of the statistics, and I'm sure I will find that. But you know, I do think it's a fascinating area, and, you know, interesting that those high levels of participation in those countries, and I say not just India, but, you know, across the developing world.
Thank you very much for that answer, Benita. The question was from Manish. So we have about 5 minutes left. I think we should probably, before closing remarks, touch on one thing about how organizations are perhaps not collaborating or cooperating as much as they could, which is on the issue of trust. Obviously, trust is a huge piece, huge element in the sharing economy. But what happens if you have a great trust rating on Airbnb and you're a newbie on, I don't know, like Rent My Dog or any other organization? Shouldn't there be more work together done on unifying that trust system?
Well, you know, what Compare and Share is on a mission to do is exactly this. So, you know, fundamentally we're an aggregator. We're a comparison marketplace of the sharing economy. And the reason for that is because what we want to do is we want people to discover the sharing economy. And one way they can do that is by having a place that they can go to where they can access the whole of the sharing lifestyle. And what we do is we promote all of those different initiatives and those different verticals via the platform. Many of you know we have a global sharing economy directory with over 7,000 listings, with 18 different verticals that we've identified in the sharing economy. It's free to list, it's free to use, and it's a resource. But what it does do, and we see by the traffic that comes through the site, is it enables people to discover the sharing economy and discover perhaps aspects and companies and organizations within the sharing economy that they may not otherwise have found. And so this question about how we bring all this together and how we collaborate as, you know, as the sharing economy and as the whole network and of organizations is actually one that is very, very dear to our heart in terms of aggregation. Now, and Compare and Share. Now, you mentioned this idea about, you know, having ratings on one platform, for example, and being a newbie on another platform. And, you know, there are a number of companies that are tackling this. So E-Rated is one example of that. And, you know, they look at aggregated ratings across multiple platforms. One of the things that I do think that's going to be incredibly important moving forward is how companies within the sharing economy share data with each other. And that potentially is both positive data and negative data. So if, for example, you know, if we take sort of a very extreme example, you know, you were to have, you know, some kind of, you know, dreadful assault that happened by using you know, some kind of ride-sharing platform, and there was, you know, there was data and information about that case that that company had, then you would want in some way that was shared with other companies that were perhaps working in, you know, in that field or within the sharing economy as a whole. So I think there are ways in which we can work together, both for good, you know, in terms of tackling some of the challenges, some of the negatives, as well as the positives. And I think we need to look at the whole picture. And what we've been doing in that realm is we've developed something called Share Trade. And Share Trade is a trust mark for the sharing economy. And essentially the idea of Share Trade is that companies and organizations would fulfill a series of criteria to get a badge that tells the user that this, both this individual or this company actually has signed up to a code of conduct, They've signed up to that there's some kind of ratings and review process, that there's some sort of verification, some kind of background check, perhaps some kind of insurance. But ultimately, it's about creating a safe infrastructure so that people are able to feel comfortable in the sharing economy. And this is how we'll grow it. We need the sharing economy to be a safe and comfortable place whilst not restricting the growth, whilst not restricting the sharing economy. We can't have sort of massive kind of, you know, there's a lot of talk about regulation, and what we don't want is to go down we need some kind of a regulatory framework that is appropriate for the sharing economy. That's incredibly important, and that's what the government are looking at in their independent review currently. That's important. What we don't need is something that is over-regulated, because that would stifle the sharing economy. We need something that really works with the ethos of the sharing economy. And so this whole notion of how we collaborate as a whole network of companies is incredibly important in this, because we need to help build this infrastructure and create this safe, trusted place in order to grow it and mainstream it.
Thank you, Benita. I think our time has come to an end, but I did want to leave with one final thing. So just a reminder for who might have just joined us, we're here live at the Disruption Innovation Festival with Benita Matowska answering the tough question, can sharers share? Do sharers share enough? So what I would like to leave our listeners with is a challenge to all the other sharing economy businesses out there. Benita, what is the one thing we all need to share more of?
We need to share more of ourselves. Fundamentally, we need to share more of ourselves. And all of these organizations, these companies, if they were really sharing more of themselves, then I believe actually there are lots of ways that we can grow this sector and mainstream this sector. And that's what it comes down to. It comes down to making some personal sacrifices. That's what it will involve.
Thank you, Benita. I believe our time is up, and for any of you interested, we're always available to answer questions, and we love having a chat about the sharing economy. So do get in touch at Compare and Share on Twitter or visit our blog. And I do think let's tell you about the cafe on thinkdiff.co. So I'll leave it up to him. Thank you so much for all of your questions. It's been a grand old time over here. And Seb, the word to you.
Yeah, so
thanks for sharing.
Thank you so much, Benita, and thank you so much, Daniel, for that really interesting and thought-provoking session. I really appreciated the insights there. And thank you to our viewers and for the questions that you sent in as well. I thought those were great as part of the discussion. So there was an article mentioned in that session that I'll make available via the event page, and I'll also, I'm sure, with Benita and Daniel's permission, put up some points of contact as well on that event page. It's probably worth our audience members knowing that we do have an archive section to the site where sessions can be rewatched, and that goes for other sessions. I believe this session will also be appearing in that archive. And I also would like to just quickly signpost the fact that next Wednesday at 5 o'clock, 5 till 7, we have our sort of grand finale live event. It's going to be live streamed from London. That session starts off with 5 till 6 with Janine Benyus and Michael Paulen talking about design using nature as inspiration, the art of biomimicry. And then very relevant to this session from 6 till 7 we have Rachel Botsman, who's another thought leader on the sharing economy, and David Rowan, the Wired UK magazine editor, talking about emerging technologies and their impact on the global economy moving forward. So that's a session not to be missed. So one final thank you to Benita and Daniel. That was a really great session. Thank you so much for joining us today and for contributing to the Disruptive Innovation Festival. And thank you to our audience for your participation.